great flux. We know from the work of an enormous number of scholars, Rudiger von Bruck and Bernhard von Bock and Hamlet Kisa and a whole other host of people, how distinguished but also how fragile the model was of the classic German university by 1914, with mushrooming student enrollments, a system that had been structurally designed for more elite educational practices becoming very stressed. This is the move from what Charles McClellan has recently called the full professor university to the institute university, the rise of the Privatdozenten movement, the creating of what Franz Eulenburg, who was a contemporary scholar at Leipzig, called the creation of an unofficial university, which was much bigger than the official university in the German ranks. The challenge to the universities in Germany of outside or parallel foundations like the Kaiser Wilhelm Gesellschaft, and which becomes the Max Planck Institutes after 1945. All of these are extraordinary problems, which and at the center of this transformation of the older German to the newer German university stands this imposing figure of Friedrich von Althoff, who was in 1882 to 1907 this extraordinary manipulator and coordinator of resources in the Prussian Ministry of Education. And Althoff becomes a kind of template, a kind of symbol of the of a national Kulturstaat strategy, mobilizing enlightened bureaucratic dirigismus and political manipulation against the traditional autonomy of the old German universities. And Max Weber's interventions, Weber becomes very interested, among the many other things he's writing, in the decade before World War I, in this tension between the autonomous university that he remembered and treasured, and the universities that Althoff and the enlightened bureaucrats in Berlin were creating. And much of Weber's work on academic freedom, for which he's now, that's kind of because of the Schill's translations and other things. One cannot understand Weber's work on academic freedom without understanding this broader context in which he was writing. Worried about the rapidly modernizing state and an emergent industrial society, challenging the older corporatistic traditions and self-governance traditions of these universities. If Germany and the United States present images of higher education systems that were undergoing impressive changes defined by high ambition, significant scientific accomplishments, new relationships with private, industrially based wealth, and fascinating governance tensions with the faculty, and for Germany with the faculty and the administrative state. In Austria, we find it seems to be a somewhat more complicated set of issues. Austria may have lacked an Althoff, but it had a profuse tradition of bureaucratic intervention that molded the fragmented and often contested state of higher education under the rival nationalities. Over 40 years ago, in 1974, Robert Kahn, I think it's good to mention his name because Peter Judson just delivered a wonderful lecture yesterday on Kahn's memory. Kahn addressed some of the same issues that I'm concerned with in an essay called Higher Education and Politics in the Austrian Constitutional Monarchy. And Kahn did so by juxtaposing the ideals of Count Leo Thun, the founder of the Austrian system in the 1850s, as a fundamental state-supporting, non-political system guaranteeing somewhat of a share of academic freedom for the faculty, but who were to train loyal Austrian patriots. Against that image of the Austrian universities, Kahn wrote then describing the later spikes and scandals like the Bar and Pharmacy affair that I'll mention in a little while, that represented for Kahn exogenous and unrepresentative party political invasions violating the true purposes of the university. For Kahn, the university system in Austria was and remained in its original design and implementation an impressive achievement, but it had the misfortune of being seized by external nefarious political forces, not of its own making, most of which were Kahn called trivial in the actual issues that were deliberated. Kahn further argued that the imperial bureaucracy saw the universities as part of a system of cultural stability for the state that was manifest in a kind of soft privileging of German cultures, elite proto-nationalism beyond and avoiding the kind of nationalism of the later 19th century. Kahn's interpretive framework was, it seems to me, defensible and viable, but it stands in very stark contrast to the image of the universities before 1918 that is embedded in more recent commentaries on the history of the universities. And this is something I found quite fascinating. If one looks at these interpretations, they're coming out of scholars influenced by and led by Oliver Rothko. These focus on the chronically dysfunctional features of university life in Austria, not only after, but before 1914. Student riots, pervasive racial anti-Semitism, lack of serious intellectual engagement by many students, university administrators and covert sympathy with student rowdiness, ethnic and racial discrimination, and faculty appointments. arguments, and the general sense of kind of mediocrity, or at least growing mediocrity, arguing that these were not simply incidental pressures from without, but they were generated from within by core elements of the university community itself. I have to say that if one looks at at those facts, and these writers and these scholars are obviously very much concerned with the period after 1918, quite rightly, in the sense that if one looks at the rate of participation of students at the University of Vienna in the 1930s in the illegal Nazi movement, Mikhail Gehler has argued that 75% of all the members of the Austrian pan-German fraternities and associations who, in the late 1920s, together with their Catholic rivals, constitute over 50% of the total student body of the Austrian universities. These students were allied with the illegal NSDAP by 1933, and many more of them were in marginal sympathy, margins of sympathy for the party. If you think of these stunning numbers, I mean, they're really quite stunning. They're not only suggestive of the extent of the radicalization of higher education in the 30s, but they present the historian of the imperial period, it seems to me, with a very striking telos that has to be recognized and ignored. You can't just ignore this stuff and sweep it under the rug. Everything was fine before 1914, and all of a sudden you have 3/4 of the students in the 1920s joining the Nazi Party. Like, how did that happen? So these portrayals, it seems to me, do not capture the portrayals of this kind of. I'm not sure what one would call them revisionist, but they are revising sort of the Kahn's view of the universities. Do not capture the full magnitude of the experience of the university before 1914. And here I think the very fundamental work of Gary Cohn on the history of secondary and tertiary education in Imperial Austria. It's extraordinarily wonderful book, Education in the Middle Class Society, published now exactly 20 years ago, so it's the 20th anniversary of the book. It seems to me Cohn set out to provide an alternative reading, or at least he establishes it. I don't want to impute motives to Gary, but it does provide an alternative reading focusing on student mobility, student demography in a society in very rapid social change. And if you've read the book, it's a very complicated book, very, very carefully crafted, both in terms of policy analysis, but also in terms of analysis of demography and movements of people, and trying to figure out who the children were, or who the late adolescents were, who actually ended up in these universities. Very interesting comparison with the German universities in terms of social mobility. But the portrait of really is one of moving forward, reacting to pressures from civil society. The universities trying to improve lecturer and faculty salaries, trying to create better institutional frameworks for their work, investing in response to public demands. And this is a theme of the book, the pressure of the public and the government in some way responding over time to these understandable pressures. If one takes Cohen's book and compares it to the recent dissertation, massive dissertation by Jan Zorman on the mobility of scholars among the Austrian universities, which is also a very different portrait of the universities than that established by what I would call the Rathkolb School. I say that in a very friendly way, in a sympathetic way. And then if one adds just Cohen's and Zorman's work, the work of a scholar like Deborah Cohen and others who have talked about the changes in curricula. There's a lot of productive debate about curriculum. Medical school, interesting, fascinating changes in the legal curriculum involving the changes in how one trained jurists in 1892, 93. All of this really gives you a different perspective on this fascinating system of ethnic-based polycratic competition and resource exchange that created many singular balance of power trade-offs, kept the individual universities enmeshed in winds of political change that were developing in the late imperial period, but in which they were actually making progress in ways that actually don't quite fit into this paradigm after World War I. But then again, how does one explain